Welcome, Lee Francis Orr from Albuquerque. Oh my goodness, I am so excited to be here in conversation with you. There's so many things I want to learn from you today. Welcome.
Oh my goodness, thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I find it funny that it takes a pandemic for us to finally get together. We were supposed to do this like 2 years ago, if I recall.
Yes.
And you had various family things when I was up in Michigan State, and I was really looking forward. So this is actually really lovely for me. I was looking forward then, and I'm really excited now that we get the time to interact.
Yay. So, Lee, tell me, like this, that you are now a publisher, you're a creator, exhibitor, you have a COMICCON bookstore. Like, how did you get to this place of just for someone like me, that's just mind blowing? Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think it goes back a little bit farther than, we started the company in 2014, or I started the company in 2014 as Native Realities. It was Native Realities Publishing. And I was really, I come out of education. So my PhD is in education, my master's in education. I have a background of writing, et cetera. And I grew up as a nerd. I'm an Indigenerd, right? So I just kept recognizing that there just wasn't any representation for my kids, for the kids I was teaching, for my community, right? So my family on my dad's side is from the Pueblo of Laguna here in New Mexico. And that's where I started my teaching career. So I was like, I've always sort of been one of those guys that can't stand around and let other people figure it out. That's my personality is like, I've waited too long. We petition the federal government as Native folks very often for things. And 40 years later, we finally get those things. So I don't tend to wait, because when I ask for it, people don't do what they are. It's sprinkly, and we can get into that. So for me, I was like, all right, well then let's just start publishing. So we launched Native Realities. The original idea was really to do a broad range of books, really just covering kids, 0 to 24. So it's gonna be like history books and kids books and like all the rest. And essentially we found that was way too big. So we just really narrowed in on doing comic books and graphic novels to start. And it just sort of matriculated out of that. We started publishing the first books, and we started getting interest. And so I was like, all right, well, I can pay back the credit cards and put out some more books. And then about 2016, kind of was viewing the landscape and was like, we really should have a trade show, because we have and I kept looking online. The fabulous Elizabeth LaFonce was posting things about like the Native Game Developers Guild, like the Indigenous game designers, right? And I was like, why don't we connect up with them? They're all going and doing this thing, and all of us are over here at the Comic-Cons, and they never get invited to the Comic-Cons because we're just doing comic books. They're over on the game side. And then I started looking at like our film and television folks as Native folks, and I was like, and they're over there in the film and television, they're Sundance and all the rest of that. And then I was looking at like our science fiction and fantasy writers, and they're going to a whole different conference. And I was like, we never all get to be in the same place. So I said, well, why don't we launch a thing called Indigenous Comic-Con? Let's put that together, and then we can bring everybody in together. We can support and promote Native creatives. We can support and promote Indigenerds, Indigenous futurisms, games, all the stuff that we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. And then we started I started Red Planet because we needed. I'll say, essentially, we needed more office space. That was really the big thing. I was like, I had just like boxes of books. I had all these banners and things from the Comic-Con just laying around my office here at the house. And my wife was like, "That's gotta go, yo, because you can't even get in there anymore." So I was like, all right. So we're just looking for office space. And then I started thinking, well, what's been really cool about the Comic-Con is that you can find all this really cool stuff, mm-hmm. But it's once a year. So why don't we open this up and make it 365, right? Or roughly three, let's make it every weekend, right? So, there was an open space in the location that we're at. And, we built it as almost like a a brewery tasting room, right? It was like, we just threw up a bunch of our books, a bunch of like used books that I had in the stock here with me. And I put them all together, and it was like, anybody can come in and buy this, but essentially it's our office. We ship out of it. And as that sort of developed, it's become its own creature and really pushed forward. And so let's see, we're in year 6 for publishing. We're in year 3 for the retail shop, and we're in year 4.5, would have been last weekend for our live event, which unfortunately was postponed, but we went digital, which was kind of cool as well, which you can find on our Facebook page, for IndigiPop X. We sort of did a name change. It was Indigenous Comic-Con. We've moved to IndigiPop X because we're doing a lot more around pop culture, wanted to get more folks involved, and, you know, just a little bit jazzier, I guess, you know, in some ways. So that was, yeah, so that's been the history of how we put it all together, how I put it all together.
I love that. And also that, you know, what's amazing about what you're doing is that we know that we've got an audience, we've got readers, we've got folks that are hungry for this. But it's just nice to kind of make it formal. Like, hey, once a year we're gonna have this big blowout, and then throughout the year we have Red Planet, and this is a space for you and people coming, you know?
Yeah.
So Lee, tell me though, this is not a surprise in many ways, right? I mean,
yeah,
you know, it's almost like, you know, with Lee Francis, 3, you know, from the Laguna Pueblo, other family members that are like in the sort of limelight as creators. I mean, tell us about your kind of life, your legacy, I guess.
Yeah, so I come by it very honestly, and we'll say that. You know, so coming out of, you know, of Laguna of Coake, which is, you know, where my dad's side is from, I've always felt that it's very much a cosmopolitan, going way back to the Pueblo Rebellion, and because of, I think, that cosmopolitan, there's been a strong focus on education, storytelling, and writing. So yeah, you know, from the picture, Leslie Marvin Silko is my cousin on my dad's side. In the picture that I'm seeing, the fellow that's there is actually Dr. Cliff Trasser. My dad is actually to the left of that picture, but my dad is in there. No, it's all right. It's all right. I was just noticing that. I was like, hey, I love that picture. That's Dr. Clifford. I also one of my big fans, and I can talk about that with my dad. You know, so my dad came, you know, from this literary space, but my dad really moved into academics a little bit later in his life, about the time I got into high school. He worked on his master's when I was a kid, and then he got his PhD in California. You know, right about the time I was finishing high school, and he started a project called Native Time. And I'm wondering if I can show you, since we're here in my home office. I think I do. Excellent. So here I have a proof, an uncorrected advanced proof of Native Time, which was my dad's first book. And what it was a history of Native people as a chronology, as a timeline, from, I think it went back to 50,000 BC here in the so-called United States, and it follows all of history, politics, and law, and all the rest of that. So anyway, he put this together, I want to say in 92 or 93, and he had a lot of connections with a bunch of Native writers and community through the family connections. And as he put that together, he created this amazing group, and he founded an organization called Wordcraft Circle of Native Writers and Storytellers. And so I was able to stay connected with, I mean, the names. I mean, like, if you think of anybody within Native Lit, at some point they've known my dad or they've been in my house, right? My family house, right? So it's really funny. I remember in college, like, I had a lit professor, a Native Lit professor at the University of Missouri, who was like a huge fan of Craig Womack and Dr. Craig's work. And I just was like, I remember coming up to her and she's like, I love Craig Womack. She was talking about his books and all the rest of it. And I was like, oh yeah, he was just in my house last weekend. He was playing guitar with my pops, right? So, like, you know, Native folks, hanging out with Native folks, you don't think about it unless other people start thinking about it. And then it's just like, oh my God, what? You know, and it's just like, yeah, they're just chilling. This is my family. This is who I hang out with. So, you know, so my dad made these really strong connections. and this incredible history, the native time. St. Martin's Press is what it came out through, and that sort of like made his, kind of made his name. And then he came here to University of New Mexico, was the first chair of Native Studies at the University of New Mexico when it moved from a program to a department. And he was, tragically, unfortunately, passed away in 2003. But, had this incredible legacy of all of these Native writers and creatives and storytellers that he very much impacted, I think, in his life. And the same goes for the other picture of my amazing aunt, Paula Gunn Allen. So we had one of those families where everybody was just kind of doing stuff. And of course, Paula was, Indigenous feminism. Like, she's the matriarch of that, right? Like, she set the terms for it, Spider-Woman's granddaughters and, all the rest of the things that she wrote, both poetry. She was a polymath, poet, academic, scholar, painter, all the rest of that. And I think that hit for most of my family. Carolee Sanchez Allen, also an incredible poet and artist and scholar. So as I always say, when I don't tend to name drop too much, except when people kind of ask her, I was like, that's my aunt on the shelf, because I was like, let's see if you got it, you got up the space. But I definitely come by it very honestly. This was one of the things in our household back when I was a little guy. Man, it would be like, we go to, our parties were like San Francisco art parties, people be slinging poetry and playing music, and it was amazing, and so it was amazing growing up in that. And I am so always just like indebted and grateful that I had such an incredible family. And I will say, even going back to my grandma, who really cultivated a lot of that through all of her kids and down to us as grandkids and all of my cousins and whatnot. So
yeah, amazing to have that kind of creativity and energy of creation as transformation is the kind of air that you're breathing as a kid. And of course you're doing that now with your family.
Right.
But yeah, Native Realities Press, I mean, Lee, this is huge. I mean,
yeah,
this is like, it's, I mean, people talk about, the engines of the East Coast publishers, and they're nothing on you. Like, Native Realities Press,
oh man, thank you,
is amazing. So yeah, to share with the world, what you're doing here.
So the goal of it, we call ourselves an Indigenous Imagination Company. Again, when we started, it was to start by publishing, K-12, 0 to 24. And as we dialed in, the whole idea was that we wanted to, and I specifically wanted to create more comic books, and get more graphic media into the world, that was Native centric, Native focused, and Native specific, and by Native folks. Because that's been one of the big caveats, is that everything that we published and produced, whether it has some non-Native folks attached to it, is Native originated, right? So we're telling our stories. And I think that's been the big thing for me, because since I grew up in the literary world, the Native literary world, I already understood what publishing houses were doing long ago, and what was happening with us as Native writers and Native storytellers in these spaces is that, the publishing houses would privilege, and I think it still continues, but they privilege one or two folks. And that was their Native quotient, and then they'd be done. And there were so many other incredible writers and storytellers that were doing incredible work coming out of smaller presses. But as you began to dig deeper, I was like, where's the comics? I grew up on comics. Like, where's the comic book artists? And really coming into, let's say, my adulthood, I would say, there were really only two. And one I wasn't entirely aware of, one I was kind of aware of. So Scout by Timothy Truman, because that came out in the 80s, and Tim is Native and created a Native character, so Native centric, Native story. And Tribal Force, John Proudstar's work. But John had a very limited release in the first one, because I was on the East Coast and he was here in the western half of the United States. It is a giant divide. So I wasn't really aware of it. So that was about it, and then you had some graphic representations, but really not comics or heroes, or really using the graphic media. medium to tell those stories, to tell our stories from ourselves as our communities. So that's what we set out to fix. Hero Twins, Dale DeForest, Wolof Jonesy, Jonathan Nelson, Dear Woman, Beth LaPonce, Six Killer, my own book, Ghost River, which we just completed with the help of the library company out of Philadelphia. Again, with Wishoya Alvitre, my favorite person to work with as a native illustrator. And we've got more. We just signed the agreement with UNM Press to create an imprint. So we have a Red Planet imprint, which is going to be their comic book, distribution site out of UNM Press, because this is, they're recognizing it as well. They're recognizing that it aligns with their mission, but also is something that needs to be done. So putting out more comics and graphic novels. And yeah, we're the ones that put out the most. We've got sister companies in First Nations Canada. There are some really great companies out of there, but in the US, and we've got some in Mexico as well, with our folks down there. There's an amazing company called 656 Comics out of Juarez. And it's not quite indigenous, but it's indigenous. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like my guy, they're specifically writing native, but like my guys down there, they are native, right? They are indigenous. And so they're it's influenced. And sometimes they don't, which we don't either. I mean, like I like to write comics. I like to write comics and games, but that's probably our partner company. They started about 2 or 3 years before us, 3 or 4 years before us. I think they were about 10 years old. I want to say 2 or 3 years ago. So we, I work with some amazing folks who also see the importance of doing this work and publishing, because the only way that I know how to fix these things is to provide more materials for folks.
I think University of New Mexico Press is going to be great for also helping to kind of further your mission of getting these into classrooms, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we need them in college classrooms on college curriculum. And I think, with Latino graphics, that's my biggest kind of, the market that I want most for our vitality and our longevity is the education markets, right?
Right. Yep.
Anyway, I love it. I love what you're doing there. Can you share some surprises along the way? I imagine you must have had some surprises.
Yeah. For creating Red Planet, again, we wanted to keep the party going all year long. And I just loved the idea of being able to work in a bookstore. So just my own selfish nature was like, I love bookstores. I love books. I love books growing up. I love bookstores. I was like, well, then I'll just make one and I'll work in it all the time. And it's been lovely. So let's see. So we'll just say the physical challenges and surprises very much is running a retail shop, right? As a creative, you're shifting into a whole different business mindset. You're an entrepreneur now, right? So as an indigenous and a native entrepreneur, just a whole bunch of different concepts that start to take place. You got to have, paper towels. Mm-hmm. You got to clean the windows. And I knew that because I used to work retail as a kid. And like, I used to clean, that was how I got my first comics. I worked at a bookstore in Santa Barbara, and, I'd trade out vacuuming and cleaning the windows to get my stack of comics. So I completely understand the concept behind it, but there's just like a whole adjustment coming from, and especially for me, coming from an academic background, right? So shifting into a business mindset. So that was a bit of a surprise. The logistics of like this, we were before all of this, we were actually closed for most of the winter because our heat broke. So I just had to go buy a bunch of space heaters, and we could only keep the shop open like on the weekends because it's too expensive to run space heaters, for the week long to keep your house warm, essentially, right? So it was like, all right, we'll fire them up on Saturday morning, we'll turn them off on Sunday afternoon, and we're only open for the weekends. Our big plan before all of the C-19, all of this stuff and the crisis that's happening was to reopen this month. We were going to like have our big grand reopening in April. Come on back out. We're open again, 5 days a week, etc. That's been derailed a little bit. So, we're still slightly operating. We're still sending some stuff out here and there. Some orders are coming in. We're fulfilling them as we can. But that's, kind of what we've run into. So that's been a couple of surprises. I will say on the bigger scale, it's been really interesting that I've never not been clear about what I'm doing. It's a native shop. You walk into the shop, you know that the books on the shelf, if you look around and you really get a sense of the space, if you take the time to look, I mean, we have one bookshelf of like mostly native comics, or mostly non-native comics. So we have a whole bunch of graphic novels. We've got a spinner rack with a bunch of the new singles and whatnot, but the rest of it is all native. Like, and I'll get people that walk in and the cognitive dissonance hits so fast, they don't recognize that. I had one woman come in at one point. She was trying to sell some books back, and this is an African-American woman. She was trying to sell books back, and she came up to the counter and she was like, "Can I buy these, you want to buy these books?" And I was like, "No, I can't," because they didn't fit what we had on the shelves. And I could tell she was like, "And why not?" And it was going to be, it seemed like it was going to start being a thing. And I'm like, we ain't gonna lie, I'm pretty light skinned. So she could look at me and be like, "What's this guy doing here?" Right. And I was like, just take a moment to kind of look around. We're not fighting. We are related, so but take a look around. This is a native bookshop. These books don't fit with what I'm going to put on the shelves. And she looks around, she takes a moment, and she was like, "Oh, that's cool." And she's like, "Yeah, no, you ain't going to buy my books." And it was really, so that was like this, I get surprises like that, right? Like people that recognize what we're doing. And once they see it, they're like, "That's so cool." Even like native folks, I love being at the shop when somebody that's been in the shop before brings a friend. Like, that's one of the most beautiful surprises. They'll bring a friend on in, and that friend will come in and they'll be like, "See, I told you this was awesome." And I was like, that's why I started this store, right?
Yeah.
So, things like that really just tend to make my day. And I think make it really worthwhile in terms of opening Red Planet.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like, it's a part of this kind of larger constellation of kind of opening spaces, not just for kind of our communities that have been historically underrepresented in these spaces, but also to invite others to kind of like, "Oh, wow, I had no idea," right?
Right. And I think that's been the thing that we really tried to do with Red Planet, was really to open up a community-based space. And I say that every time, is like, it's not just for native folks, it's for indigenerds. And as I define an indigenerd, it's anybody that wants to see positive, dynamic representations of native people in popular culture. That makes you an indigenerd. You don't have to, it's not a card. It's not a CDIB card where I got to hold up and be like, "Oh, I'm an indigenerd because I'm native and I'm a nerd." I don't tend to believe that. It's like, come into my shop. You get some indigenerd on you, and you get to take that with you. Right?
Yeah, I love that.
Because we are so marginalized anywhere else. I don't see my comics. I don't see comics by native people. I don't see comics by Latinx. I don't see comics, very rarely, oftentimes with African-American folks that are front facing in the comic shops. Right. And that's the other part that we really do with, and then I got your next question up, is that we also, for the mass media comics that we do carry, our trades and our singles, we focus primarily, either it's a character of color or writer of color. So that's the other part. That is our obligation, because we know that there's not a lot of native comics out there. We'd have a very small selection. I understand that. So the extra stuff that we carry, though, is that we privilege, comics of color. So it's either a character or writer, artist of color that we put on our shelves. And we're very forward facing. And I have no problems telling people that. I was just like, cool, there's some amazing comic shops in this town. Like, I don't want to say, if you don't find what you want here, that's the free market, kids. You can go down the block. And I'm not saying you just, like, we don't carry it. There you go. So that's what we do.
So you've talked a little bit about, the Indigenous COMICCON now, IndigiPop X, but this is like huge. And now I just noticed that you're in Australia now.
Yep.
Yeah. So
we were this last year.
Yeah. So I want to hear all about, you've talked about like opening the space to gain, other creatives, but how it's global, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's global and it's traveling. So let's see, 4 years ago, 2016, we started. We had a couple of folks from local, localities up in Denver. Some of the native folks up in Denver decided they wanted to host it up there. So we did our road show up there this last July. And then this last December, just right before the wildfires hit, for our Indigenous folks over in Australia, the community over there wanted to bring this out. And that had been like a 2-year process of kind of talking and figuring out how we're going to do this internationally. How do we, like, what do we do? And we've been, our idea was that we are very, the legalities get really sticky because, like, we're not a huge company, so we can't, like, Disney trademark stuff in multiple countries and all the rest of that. So it's more of just been like a Johnny Appleseed, right? So it's like, hey, I started this thing, and now this is a gift and a blessing to you. You go on and you plant and start this thing. And that's what we kind of threw out to the community over there. So Melbourne, Australia, November 29th to December 2nd, so their summer. It was this incredible event, and they brought in a whole bunch of folks that we're connected to now. Great artist by the name of Michael Mulipola, is a Pacific Islander. He, and I think I've met him before, but maybe not. I don't know. We were trying to figure that out. I was like, where have you been? When have I been there? Right. But he, is looking at it. We had family and friends that are just like, we need to do this in New Zealand. We need to do this in Hawaii. We need to bring this up to First Nations. We need to bring this to California. So prior to all this, all of the crisis that we're dealing with, and we're going to have to see, we're looking at being in LA in the fall, because we have a lot of Native folks that are there. We have a huge contingency of Native folks in Southern California, obviously the tribes that are there and all the folks that were relocated, and all of our actors are there. So we wanted to definitely do some stuff with our actors, and bring them into play. And, so that was, so Southern California was the shot. And so now we're trying to figure out what all that's going to do. But, essentially that's what we were looking at. And,
sorry, Lee. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, go ahead. No, that was it. Yeah.
When you were in Australia, I'm curious, what was the kind of audience? Who was coming and excited about what you guys were doing? Yeah.
There were a number of community folks, which was really, really lovely. And then there were academic folks, there were young people, there were people from the community, there were non-Indigenous folks in that space. So it was, they had timed it at the same time as this thing called the Nation Dance. So you had like dancing that was going on. We had a couple of folks that came over, myself and Desba Rose, who is a Native cosplayer. So she came over and got to showcase some really cool stuff. I met some academic folks that had been over for the first COMICCON in the United States, when we first put it on here in Albuquerque, year 1, and they were over there for that as well, or they were in Melbourne because they were located out of Sydney, I think, or Melbourne somewhere, I can't remember. But they were like, oh yeah, I don't think you remember me. I met you, but you were a crazy man. And I was like, I was a crazy man that first year. I was running around every year. But they were like, it's like, oh, that's wild. And so so that was a whole thing, of being able to see, all these folks that had come over internationally. So it was this incredible mix. I was blessed to be a part of it.
Yeah, I love it. I love that it's kind of planetary, because we need that. We need, of course, affirmation of difference, within and across our communities, but also solidarity, right, across our communities.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, you, me, others, the creators that are kind of in our orbits and those that are outside of our orbit are doing so much to kind of actively complicate and transform the kind of social space, the sort of imaginary of the, and yet, gosh, the mainstream seems still so fixed on these types. I mean, what's your reaction to, some of this stuff that, seems to persist? And how do you react to this? How does your 9-year-old react to this?
He's still learning. And I think it was a learning process for me as well, right? I think it is that sort of transformational learning component. Sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't. I remember stories from when I was a kid. I had a really, my dad we're a Native family, so it was very strong activism. My folks sent me to school in first grade with a black armband on Columbus Day, right? So we were doing anti-Columbus long before it really hit sort of the mainstream collective consciousness, right? Like my dad was like, boo, you know, straight up hashtag F Columbus, right? So, you know, we weren't playing in my household, but I didn't recognize that, because I think that development is when you grow in, when you're in a household like that, unless you're, you know, your family and your community is really, you know, strongly activist in a particular way. I know that's not as meant as disrespect. It's more of like how you grow up into that space. If you're growing up into it a little bit different, it takes a little longer to recognize. And it took a little longer for me to recognize what was happening within the pop culture sphere until I really started to investigate it. And I want to say that I started recognizing in certain spaces, but I would always start to gravitate towards, you know, sort of native representations in pop culture. I love Predator because of Billy Soul, right? So Billy was just like the native, he was the native badass. I still think Billy Soul is awesome as a character in pop culture, because you didn't see in the 80s any native character, and if you did, it was so traditionalized, unless it was like an independent film like, you know, Herald of Orange or Powwow Highway or something like that. You know, and here he is, he's just one of the guys, one of the war buddies, you know, he doesn't have feathers in his hair. Right. But as I always say, I was like, it's super cool because he's the first guy to notice the danger based on traditional stories. Like, that's the coolest part, is he's all like, oh yeah, I already know this thing is going to murder all of us because it already did it 200 years ago to my people because we were the strongest warriors on this continent. And I was like, and that doesn't speak to like, and I know they didn't do it intentionally in that sense, but like, we can sort of rebuild history a little bit. But I was like, that's what I was like, this guy's awesome. And it cuts, you know, with the machete on the bridge, and he's the last one standing. Now, as I've taught it later, I was like, that's totally Last of the Mohicans, right? Like, that's total native transference. He's the last one, and he, you know, sacrifices himself for the white character to survive, right? So, I mean, I can get into it the academic side, but growing up, you know, that was really, it was exciting for me. And I still remember going to see Dances with Wolves in the theater. I still remember to go see, you know, Last of the Mohicans in the theater, which I still think is a pretty positive representation, all things being told, in popular media, because there was so little. And so not only were we playing with like all of these representations, you know, like the whites playing Indian, the native, I call it the Red Devil, so the indigenous hordes, but I you know, as in my talks, I term it the Red Devil. I mean, basically America goes through 4 phases. It's the noble savage, the vanishing Indian, the Red Devil, and the tragic chief, right? Or the crying Indian. And so there's like the 4 periods of native representation in pop culture. And you can see all of these, but also the thing that plays off of all of this is erasure, because we weren't seen as native folks in popular media. And when we were, it was these things. So you didn't have native folks that were, you know, you didn't have a Charles Eastman, you know, as a native doctor, as a native writer, right? You didn't have, you know, you didn't have a Maria Tallchief. Like, you didn't see Maria Tallchief's biography. What did you see? You saw Jim Thorpe. And I love me some Jim Thorpe, but it's the only thing you would see. And what does it do? It fits the model of native masculinity that comes from the noble savage. Jim Thorpe is the noble savage in that sense, right? Here he is this, and everybody, and he didn't even get to be played by a native the first time he was played. It was Burt Lancaster, right? So what we see in this stuff is, you know, I think it's, when I talk to young folks, and when I have a whole talk on this, is identifying all of these particular spaces of natives in popular culture and the media that surrounds them, and that has surrounded us as, you know, as native folks. And it's really where the name of the company comes from, which is that we want to portray native realities. We don't want to just portray what we've seen for 400 plus years. We want to showcase native folks doing really cool technological stuff. We want to showcase, if we're going to talk about histories, let's talk about, you know, natives not being victims and tragic, you know, and fetishizing on native tragedy, but talking about native agency. And I think I came by that honestly in my household, but I had a really great, my academic advisor for my doc program, Dr. Miguel Guajardo, down at Texas State, you know, as an educator, was fabulous. And we had a long conversation about the braceros. And it's so impactful for me, because we started talking about, because his brother, Francisco Guajardo, down at UTPA, you know, had been doing all of these oral stories, and how it reflected on me, indigenous, you know, but also like, you know, immigrante, and like all the folks that were coming over, is like, you know, we continue to portray, like he was telling me, they continue to portray in popular media the braceros as victims, right? Like, here's the braceros, they are victims in this, you know, and they're just victimized by white supremacy. And I was like, whenever you portray a narrative like that, you eliminate the agency from grandma and grandpa and from your ancestors who figured out a way to survive, because that's why you're standing here, right? So they figured out a way. Many of their relatives did not survive, and they learned and they passed that on to you. And when we take that agency away, all the stuff that's here, all the stuff that we see in popular media about Native folks is about taking away, is stripping our agency and stripping our imagination. So for me, what I've tried to do with all of the work that I've done is, how do we spark that imagination? Because what they did when they came over was that they destroyed our physical bodies, right? They came over, the genocidal practices, the ethnocidal practices. And then when they put us in boarding schools, they took away our language, they took away our land, right? They took away our culture. But most, I think, the most tragically was that they took away our imagination. And if we have no imagination, we don't know where we're going next. And so we see these nihilistic behaviors within our own communities that I can't say are entirely based on the circumstances. Being pushed onto a reservation, you know, and being part of that has to be coupled with propaganda. Because why would I stay on the reservation? Listen, if I'm ready to die, I'm ready to die. I'm just going to leave. But you figured out how to make us believe that we were victims. And that's the part that we want to spark out of, right? It's not to say that there isn't atrocities. It's not to say that there isn't, you know, continued atrocities in ethnocide and the continued and perpetual work. We just saw it with the Mashpee Wampanoag, right? They just lost their reservation status. You know, that was a week ago, in the middle of all this. Here's our people. They got no reservation no more. So they're still taking our land away. But we still have our agency, and we still got these. And if we can spark this with this, that's the imagination, and we will continue to survive. And that's what I try to do. So all this stuff that we see around these representations, the counterpoint to all of this is saying, how do we flip that? By taking our own stories, being the heroes of our own stories, and sparking the imagination onto the 7th generation.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. So on that same note, let me ask you, Lee, you have a PhD, you're in in education. And maybe some people might say, well, where is that space for you today? You know, why aren't you, or where, you know, why didn't you decide to go in this direction or what have you? And how would you answer that? Yeah.
My favorite joke. I love that question, because people are like, oh, you got a PhD in education. You know, you run in a school, you're like working at a university. I was like, no, I opened a comic shop. That was my favorite, right? Because people flips people's lids. I think I didn't go into an education to do educational administration. I love writing, and I love academic writing, and I love, you know, the intellectual challenge of writing. But my focus has always been on, I will say this, decolonizing / indigenizing our spaces, right? So there's a difference. My people don't need to be decolonized in that sense. The outsider needs to be decolonized. They need to stop being colonists. We need to re-indigenize. We need to remember that we're indigenous people, right? So, and I steal that from one of my sisters, you know, who put that forward to me. I was like, that's genius, right? We're not decolonizing. Like, we can't stop colonization. It's the outsider that needs to stop colonizing. You stop colonizing, we'll re-indigenize, we'll all get along, right? So I think for me, the PhD did two things. And when I went in, I was very clear about what I wanted to do, which was to focus on my community and to focus on how we, you know, look at the multitude, or the multiverse, if you will, of spaces of learning. I had such a great advisor, you know, Dr. Wahardo was such a great advisor, because I had a lot of freedom and flexibility to pull so much in my dissertation and my studies. And I'm so blessed by that. I spent a semester, you know, doing an independent study on museum studies, right? Which he encouraged. He was like, cool, learn about museums. I was like, great. So I learned the whole structure of museums and how we're presenting information. how we're, how we're storing knowledge, right? Because that's what museums do, how we transmit knowledge. So it's very interesting. What happened was I just sort of transitioned out of, doing the formalized education, which was a school system because I was in school improvement, to an informal, because I think the media is so super important. Because I don't think, and I've done this for 20 years now, I've been teaching since I was 25, I'm 42, right? It's almost 20 years, at this point, that I've been within school systems. And what I see is that for all the best efforts of us putting together, curricula, when you put a curriculum into a school, it's not going to stick if all of your media is racist, right? If all of your media is Indian in the cupboard, or Last of the Mohicans, or all the rest of that, you're just undermining everything that you're trying to do with the curriculum itself. Mm-hmm. So part of me moving into this side is saying, and this is really where we've come into, is like, I have to create the media that we can then get into our education systems. And so my advocacy is around supporting not only the curricular work, because I have the background to do this, I know how to create, curricular systems and, and structures, and how to work within school systems and how the, processes work. But then I also have to focus on saying, if all around your room, if you got posters up all around your room and all they are is white faces, right? Or all they are is non-native faces, and you're teaching in Taos, or you're teaching in, the South Valley here in Albuquerque, what are my kids going to think? And it doesn't mean that they have to you don't have to get rid of Iron Man, but I'd like to have Super Indian and Iron Man exist on the same bookshelf. So for me, that's where, Indigenous comics comes in, because it's also really accessible. And where I think my PhD has led is that I have the fundamentals to walk the talk, or talk the walk, whatever, right? Like, I have the fundamentals. I know theory, I know critical race theory, I know structural theory, but I apply it with a pop culture lens. Mm-hmm. And I stay up on that. And I'm very well aware of that, so that I can then work within the institutions to give my kiddos, my students, as I consider Native students, the best opportunities they have to learn and find things that represent them in those spaces, so that they will gravitate more towards who they are, which, as we know, makes better learners.
Wow. Okay. So this kind of nicely leads, as we're sort of beginning to wind down here. Yeah. I think you've already kind of mentioned so much here that's vital, and the kind of heartbeat of kind of indigenous comics, pop culture. Is there something that you in particular would like us to be thinking about right now?
Yeah, I think the big thing that we're really pushing forward on, and we did it this year, would have done it this year, and we kind of did it in the digital space, is really around Indigenous futurisms. And the more that I've really, dug into the concepts, and, starting with Dr. Grace Dillon, and her magnificent work of formalizing the concepts and, the theoretical framework of Indigenous futurisms, and then really carried on by Beth and by her daughter, Elizabeth, Dr. LaPonce. I really feel that is really, in essence, what we're doing. And I think there's a huge fundamental shift when we begin to talk about Indigenous futurisms and how we're crafting and creating stories around that. That's just really sparked my imagination, because I think it's, even just putting those two concepts together creates a cognitive dissonance, right? Because Indigenous, what we think of is tradition, culture, and history, right? And futurisms, we put that together, it's like, science fiction, space, and, the apocalypse, right? Because we're doing that right now. So like those two come together, they don't necessarily fit in the brain. And I've always said, when you create that, and you do it in a way that's creative, you create a little window. Once you create that little window, that's where the learning takes place. That's your transformational learning space, right? That little window, you open that up. And so by creating and bringing these two together, you're creating that little window in every action of creativity that comes from Indigenous futurism. So I've been really keen on that. So it's a little bit beyond Indigenous pop culture, moving into this different space. So that's where I think that, honestly, our future, if you will, is truly existing, right? It's digital natives. We're digital natives, truly. We're digital indigenous. I don't know what it is. So that's the space that we're operating in. And I think that that's really, really keen. I think also a huge, you know, leap forward that I really want to see more of, that we've been trying to do, and I can see, you know, Joshua Whitehead, you know, on the thing, is like, I love the work, and I want to see more, you know, Two-Spirit, LGBTQ plus comics in our own communities, right? Because I think there's a lot of great creators that are doing that. Definitely want to see more of that work. You know, if we're going to look along literature, I want to see like more genre work. I want to see more stuff by, you know, in the sci-fi fantasy realm. Wayoti is doing some amazing things. Of course, they're doing the indigenous futurism stuff. I want to see, you know, more, you know, fantasy. Daniel Heath Justice, like, you know, wrote the fantasy right now. I know there's a few more, but I was like, he has it's the big book. It's the one on my shelf. I'm like, I want to see more of that. Like, and Native folks really playing in those realms, you know, just, I think that's where it needs to exist. And I think that's where that energy and that spark come from, so that I can look at a bookshelf, and my bookshelf is not histories anymore. My bookshelf is futures and fantasies and comics. That's what I want to see.
Wow. Okay. So Lee Francis, for telling us, you know, affirming us and clearing spaces for kind of re-indigenizing, decolonizing, and speculative future looking. Thank you, Lee Francis, for.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I'm so glad we got to hang out for a little while. This is awesome.